And on that note, welcome back to the Mars on Life podcast. I'm your host, as always, Sebastian Shug. With me, as always.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. With you, as always, Ryan Mancini.
Dude, nice
coming in
Gilbert.
live from northern
Nice,
LA County.
Nice Gilbert Gottfried impression there. Anyway,
what a week it has been. What a week.
I mean, I got my teeth cleaned yesterday, and needless to say, I don't have gum disease, thankfully. But it's one of those things, you go to the doctors or the dentist, and they make you feel like fucking garbage, right? And, like, oh, you haven't flossed. But they do it in a passive-aggressive kind of way. Oh, your gums are looking a little fucked up there. We're going to have a 3, a 4, a 5, because, when they check it with the pick, right?
Yeah.
They don't say that it's all messed up, because obviously if your teeth were perfectly spotless, you wouldn't need to go to the dentist, right?
Right.
But anyway, no, they didn't put me under, which was bad. But speaking of that, I have wisdom teeth that are still not out, so that was violent.
Yeah, I've delayed my dentist appointments, and I sense I will be delaying my next one, given that we are on the precipice of another lockdown.
They're surprisingly keeping it under wraps, though. Not there's a policy now where no more than one person can be in the receptionist room.
Okay.
Waiting, so that's good. And they only have
one.
They only have one doctor or dentist working on you at a time. And I mean, appointments are just open right now. So
yeah,
honestly, if you want to schedule anything, schedule it now. It's better than gingivitis. This is not sponsored by Crest, Colgate, AIM, Sensodyne, whatever the fuck. But brush your teeth.
Yeah. Brush your teeth, wash your ass, wash your hands, and wear a mask. That's what life is all about right now. But
pretty much.
Yeah, the last week has been pretty wild. We've had some lows, like Commander-in-Chiefer having his death rally in Tulsa. That was kind of a hoot to watch, and especially the fallout. Batman, he is Batman. Michael Keaton is in talks to come back as Batman, which is literally the best news of 2020. And I also saw Gone with the Wind, which movie's trash.
I was gonna say, you're mentioning the highlights here.
It's the highs and lows of the last week, and I'm naturally including the things that were highs and lows for me. The high being Michael Keaton potentially coming back as Batman, and the low being watching 4 hours of 1939 glorification of the South, which it's some of the most nauseating stuff I have had to live through. And Donald Trump is president of the United States. That's how it's on that level of insanity, this movie. Mm-hmm. And then guess what? On Amazon Prime, it was the number one movie. And I think
it was a backlash. It was a backlash.
I genuinely thought that at first, but I do think that it was out of curiosity that people wanted to see what made the movie so offensive and so horrible. And I'll make this brief.
You said it was made in the 30s, right?
Correct. Yeah, 1939.
At a time when everything was fucking horrible.
Pretty much. Yeah. Oh, you're not wrong. You are not wrong, my friend.
If you weren't jumping off bridges and buildings from losing your job, you were watching shitty movies, which was ironically to keep you from not jumping off bridges and buildings. So,
and realistically, if I have to be totally fair with the movie, I'll say this. There is some beautiful cinematography in it, and there is stuff in the movie in terms of filmmaking that is unique and something I have genuinely not seen before. Outside of that, the characters are deplorable. They are not likable in any way, shape. You could totally remove the fact that these people own slaves and basically own human property, which already devolves them as humans. But if you take that away and just leave the characters as they are, like say the movie was set in like, I don't know, Wisconsin or something in the same time period, and it had the same genteelism, except it's snowier and some people have a slightly Canadian accent rather than a slightly British accent, because there were, for some reason, a lot of Brits on this movie. And they're just unlikable characters. And they're just bad characters that I don't want to be on any journey with them. And I even reached out to a friend of mine telling her that I was watching it. I treated it like an experiment, because I reached out to a ton of people, a ton of film people that I know, saying, I'm watching this movie, pray for me, said the atheist. And the funny part was when one friend of mine said that Scarlett has a character arc. And I held on to that for the next 4 hours that I was stuck watching this bloody train wreck. The movie wants you to think she has a character arc. She doesn't. She's the same petulant child from the opening scenes to the very, very end, when she's finally told that old Rhett doesn't give a damn. And by the way, the ending, it has about as many endings as the bloody Return of the King. And the movie's already like 4 hours long.
Well, so, I mean, to quote one of my favorite movies, this horrible movie that everyone hates, but the character especially, Randall Graves, there's only one return in a trilogy, and it's not of the King, it's of the Jedi, okay? Now, it's kind of funny that you say that, because I was recently on a 20s to 30s decade movie kick, and it was primarily brought upon through Wizard of Oz, more specifically the stage play Wicked. And I was, there was something just off about the whole like Wizard of Oz thing, looking at it now. I mean, there's a lot of like conspiracy theories about what happened. I mean, It's not so much a conspiracy theory as it is a fact that Judy Garland got beat the fuck out of off camera. Right. These 30s movies, they age like fucking milk is what they do. Right. And as classical as they indeed are, as much as they sparked a cinematic revolution in their own regard, I don't know. I'm not, my little guy down there isn't cranking to fucking watch these movies anytime soon. Okay. Like, it's like a passing thought. It's just these movies that we used to look at as like renowned classics. And you start to get older and you're just like, minus kind of the whole like political correctness, representational errors back then as in comparison to now, movies they just ain't that good,
But I'll say this though, one movie that is never going to be, I cannot see. I'll put it this way, it came out after Gone with the Wind, and it's in black and white, and even though it takes place during probably one of the darkest periods of the last century, it is a movie that stands the test of time, and I would argue it's about as relevant now as it was in the 1940s, and that's Casablanca. And I think that's a film that I for Mother's Day, I bought my mom a copy of this book called We'll Always Have Casablanca. I decided that this was a book that she would probably appreciate more than me, just because this is her favorite movie. It's my dad's favorite movie. But on top of that, what I found out, and this is something that I know I'm going to have to read it after she's done reading it, there's a really good refugee story and a good immigrant story, not just within the film, but behind the scenes as well. And if I knew more, I'd talk more about it, but obviously we have our topics to get to. So, but I'll just say that by comparison, it's not even it's not even a question. Casablanca is the superior film between that and Gone with the Wind. I'd rather have Humphrey Bogart save my ass than Rhett Butler, because Rhett Butler doesn't give a damn about anybody who needs to get out of anywhere, and that's that.
It's a little bit more like Walken, but all right.
Well, no.
He had this watch up his ass, right? Man, I never on the topic of movies, I never understood the hype with Pulp Fiction. You watch it fucking once, and then you watch it again to catch the things you don't miss. And people regard it as the best movie. I'm sorry, I'm more of a Reservoir Dogs kind of guy, but
thank you. Because
there is a way to do non-Euclidean fucking cinematic structure, and Reservoir Dogs nails it where Pulp Fiction doesn't. Sue me, crucify me, I don't give a fuck, okay? Could cut out.
Bruce Willis.
Bruce Willis. You could cut out the entirety of Bruce Willis's part. Would not make a difference.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I mean, there's two things that you look out for in that movie. It's Sam Jackson, and it's the scene with Christopher Walken. Those are really the only scenes that, in my mind, are well worth watching in that film. Reservoir Dogs, love it. Love the whole movie. Some of the flashbacks get a little long, but
yeah,
you know what? It's part of the story, and it's necessary. And if you want another good Tarantino performance, he has you can't really call it a cameo, but he has a whole scene dedicated to him in Desperado by Robert Rodriguez. It was like one of Antonio Banderas' first big films in the States. Same with Salma Hayek, same with Danny Trejo. This was like the movie where all three of them kind of became a little more mainstream. And it's kind of a smaller film too. One day, oh my goodness, the El Mariachi trilogy, that's something you and I have to watch. But before we talk more about guys with throwing knives, let's touch on some news. We have some news that we can cover here on the Mars on Life podcast, which you're listening to right now as I speak.
Speaking of which, as well as listening, you could also watch the Mars on Life podcast. Our YouTube page is now fully operational now. Currently, I'm uploading more episodes on my external monitor. It's been a doozy making each waveform from scratch. However, the rate at which we're going to be producing videos is recording the audio, editing the audio, getting it sent back to me to be converted, putting it in video, uploading the video, assuming YouTube doesn't have a fucking aneurysm and actually accepts files over a gigabyte. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be a while before the audio and the video episodes are neck and neck, so just take that as it comes. We're doing it as fast as we can. Let's go on to the news. So
now witness the firepower of this fully armed and operational battle station. Sorry, you said newly operational, and that's what it reminded me of.
I had a feeling you were going to go off. So Vanity Fair, to start off, I'll do my little tangent first.
Yeah, go for it.
Tangent.
Wrong show.
Yeah, pretty much. Vanity Fair states, not to be pro-art desecration, but I simply love this terrible restoration. Bit of an opinion piece. Okay. So an restoration of a Spanish painting goes horribly wrong, but also in its own way right, because art's fucking subjective, hurdy-her. An elderly parishioner in Borja, a northeastern Spanish town, took it upon herself to restore the Ecce Homo. The then octogenarian painted a sort of holy howler monkey in lieu of the original, the hubris. The earnestness, the do-gooder impulse gone wrong. It was a kind of masterpiece in its own way. As much as I do believe that everything is art, I mean, come on. I'm looking at it right now, dude. Like, really? You're going to restore it and you're going to make it this? Okay, this is like if your car exhaust gets fucking shit canned and you try to replace the pipe with a Coca-Cola can, okay? And duct tape. Yeah, and Continuing, some folks are outraged, as they probably should be. Like this man that Guardian interviewed, Fernando Carrera, a professor at the Gallican School for the Conservation and Restoration for Cultural Heritage. I don't think this guy or these people should be referred to as restorers. Let's be honest. They're bodgers who botch things up. They destroy things. And bodgers who botch things up, those are fighting words. Okay. The argument over restoration versus I guess, authenticity, leaving a painting in its decrepit, if it should be that condition, manner. It always kind of interested me, especially in the realm of, well, my interests, for example. I used to collect vintage video games, like cartridges and whatnot. And understandably, these games are 20, 30 years old. Okay, never mind the fact that the internal guts may not work. The plastic does not simply stand the test of time, right? There's discoloration primarily. I stumbled upon a YouTube channel where this guy, you know, middle-aged Texan guy, super down-to-earth, super nice. He handles old computers and stuff like that. He actually restored the labels through Photoshop and you know, reapplied them. And at first I was just like, okay, this guy making a hobby out of this. He posted on YouTube, making a little bit of a living off of this. This is fine. No, apparently it's not fine. There is also another YouTuber who goes by the name of Contry. Some listeners may know him as Pat the NES Punk. Used to be a fan. Let's just say I'm not anymore, and partly due to this reason. He has a podcast as well, right? And this is not in no way plugging it, but this feeds into the authenticity versus restoration argument, because he was fucking tearing this guy a new one, saying how, you know, there's a lot of rare NES, Super Nintendo, Genesis like games. Understandably so. They're made in limited quantity, and it's no surprise that people can just now with a computer print out bogus labels and slap them on a cartridge and sell them for thousands of dollars, because some of them do go for legitimately tens of thousands of dollars. So the issue is indeed there. But we're talking about people like this guy who did it for leisure, came off as kind of whiny. At least that's what I took away from it, as well as what everyone in the YouTube comments took away from it. So, you know, tangent aside, and I guess middle-aged people arguing over the internet aside, what do you make out of the whole, I guess, art restoration and whether or not it should be allowed, I guess you could say?
Well,
because there's a certain limit where, you know, if you choose to restore something, the expectation is placed upon you that, okay, you are making this better at the cost of, you know, maybe devaluing a bit of its history because it doesn't have the original label anymore, right? Or doesn't have the original content. So yeah, what do you think?
Well, I think in terms of items or anything, any kind of a, I don't know what you'd call it, a souvenir or a knickknack, or, you know, if it's an item over the last century, say, for example, and I can use a reference that springs to mind because my folks just had an episode of it on the other night. They're you know, the TV show Pawn Stars?
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah, I figured that was a stupid question. But anyway, you know, they had a gentleman come to the shop with a Man from U.N.C.L.E. toy gun set. Now, he made it clear, and he really hammered home that this was something original. This was something that had been hiding in his closet, and he never opened it. He never really, like, he touched the stuff, but he never took it out of the box. And ultimately, the thing that knocked the price down was the fact that they had like plastic winches, or basically like these plastic clips holding the toy gun and toy gun parts in the box. Whereas back in the day, when the Man from U.N.C.L.E. was still on TV, those parts were being held in by rubber bands that basically fossilized and fell apart in the decades since. Right. Now, in that case, a minimal restoration, yeah, it will knock down the price, but if you want it to still look like it's mint in the box, even though there really is no in the box part of this item, you can still make it presentable with something that might knock the price down. Okay, fine. So be it. When it comes to artwork or an ancient artifact, I become more along the lines of a preservation I guess as a preservationist rather than a somebody who's going to restore it in some capacity, because I think unless there's something seriously wrong with the artifact or the painting or artwork in general, then you really cannot get Mr. Bean on the job to fix it. Mm-hmm. Because you end up with Whistler's mother in the Bean movie, which, by the way, that is some of the greatest art restoration I've ever seen, only because you went from this dark, gothic, drab painting, and I'm looking at it right now, so if I start laughing uncontrollably, that's why. But you look at it now, and it's like it's one of the silliest things you'll ever see, but that's because you're basically, it's a new age art style. You're combining different art styles, even in the act of restoring it. And of course, restoring it basically means you've now got a huge gray spot where Whistler's mother's head was. And so you draw the picture of a bald guy with a nose about 4 inches long off his face, and he's smiling and he looks like Carl Pilkington rather than Whistler's mother. You've created a work of art to some degree. Now, if you're trying to have the item resemble what it did in its heyday, or resemble what it looked like when it wasn't sitting out in the sun because, everybody must see the artwork, let's have all of our stuff outside, which was a thing back in the day.
Right.
It's tricky, and you really need to have people that know what they're doing. They run over everything with a fine-tooth comb, and they also need to be a good judge of character when it comes to saying either yay or nay in regards to whether or not a piece of artwork can be restored. Because I've seen the how's it pronounced? The Ecce Homo painting.
Yeah.
I've seen that. And that argument that I gave for Whistler's mother after Mr. Bean had his teddy bear hands on it, I would probably apply the same thing with Ecce Homo, just because I've seen that restoration and it makes me laugh every time. Only because they made Jesus look like a Beanie Baby. But
when they did that restoration, I was just like, what the fuck is that?
Oh, I lost it.
Oh my god.
Because I think too, and to some degree this kind of ties in a slight bit with our secondary topic. It's almost like we need to think about art in society and how our society moving forward with said art, how we want that society to move forward, and I think there's some pieces of art that, and it's very subjective too, because obviously if somebody were to say, let's get nuts with the Mona Lisa and make her look like Elmo from Sesame Street, mm-hmm. I'd have a meltdown. I'd be like, no, absolutely not. Don't do it.
That's where making it into a derivative work would come in, where you'd make understandably a copy to edit.
It's difficult as well, just because, with as much artwork that's available to us, it's, again, it's about culture and it's about what we preserve, and it does start to become a little bit tricky as to how exactly we prioritize that. And obviously, given how bureaucratic the 21st century is, it's not like that could ever happen where we would say, well, let's let's restore this painting, but make sure we have Frida Kahlo resemble Mickey Mouse instead, which, by the way, I would never advocate that for any of Frida Kahlo's artwork. She's one of my favorite artists. I'd never do that. But
no, yeah. Well, what I was saying earlier before it kind of dropped off there was, in the argument of making it a derivative work where you would make a copy of it, you wouldn't edit the original nor try to restore it, but you'd make a copy of it to make a different statement. Yeah. I think that that's an effective workaround. I really, because you can preserve history and make something that's technically non-copyrighted. It's actually re-copyrighted to the artist that did that work.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is what what I fucking deal with in the realm of publishing, more specifically in the realm of satire, because you're commentating on it, but what is and what isn't, copyrighted commentary. What am I or not? What am I or aren't I allowed to say?
Right.
So.
Yeah, and I think I think there's a lot of really good people out there that do a lot of good restorative work on pieces of art, and typically it's stuff that's very minimal. It's not like it isn't, and typically, and of course this is why something like this drops in the news. Typically, when all goes well, it's like a minor correction or a minor, injection of ink, and the artwork is back on display, lickety-split, or it's back in the gallery. Now, if it's something really heavy-duty, that's where you got to make sure you got somebody that's really, really good on their toes to fix it. And hell, that's something that I've been noticing a lot, and this is actually the best transition I can think of for our next topic, plural, topics, is there was some news story I was watching recently about a guy who had the Confederate flag tattooed on his arm, and he went to a tattooist. Presumably that tattooist, he had his shop open because of COVID reopenings that are going to be obsolete in a few weeks' time, foreshadowing. But they decided, well, we're just going to put an eagle over it and cover it up so you don't see the Confederate flag. And I mean, yeah, you're exchanging one patriotic extreme for another, but okay, as long as it's not an eagle that is questionable, then fine, go ahead with it. But also we've had in the news lately a lot more statues being taken down and a lot more monuments being either defaced, removed, or in the case of a few, dragged in the streets. I believe there was one in the UK of a British slaver where they pulled him down and they dragged the statue through the streets before they tossed him into a river somewhere. And my immediate comment was, the Brits are partying like it's 1775, because that's exactly what we did to King George III statue back then when we decided, you know what, we've had it. And I don't know if you have gotten any chance to see it yet. I guess I'm assuming your Twitter engagement has been close to nil, just because Twitter is such a deplorable, wretched hive of scum and villainy.
Oh God, don't even get me fucking started.
Well, don't worry, my friend, because it was myself now who has had to deal with social media and its discontents and malcontents, for that matter. And a lot of it stemmed from this really great video that the wonderful people at LA Taco, if you haven't subscribed to them, by the way, listeners, do it. Save local news. You're saving LA news, and you're getting a taste of LA that you're not going to get anywhere else. So check out LA Taco. But yeah,
I'll check out LA Taco when they respond to my email about PR for my publishing company. That's besides the point. I'm totally kidding.
And they're a place close to my heart. That was where a good buddy of mine shared what happened to him at LA Weekly. He wrote his piece for LA Taco, but I digress. they had somebody who was present at Olvera Street where a statue of Father Junipero Serra was removed. Now, brief history lesson.
Dare I say Jesus Christ?
Oh yeah. Well, Junipero Serra, just kind of brief history lesson. He was by large the guy that was leading the whole Catholic mission into California in the late 1700s. He established several of the, I think, 21 or so missions that are in the state of California. And, in recent years, he's been canonized, which means he is now Saint Junipero Serra. And his history has finally caught up with him because you've had a lot of indigenous activists and, people of color basically showing up to say, you know what? We don't want this guy to be represented. He basically put a lot of indigenous people into slavery through the mission system. And on top of that, he forced conversion on quite possibly thousands of indigenous people that were living in the state of California. And whole cultures were totally lost to time. Languages, cultures, histories. There were whole nations that were lost in the decades following Serra's path through the colony of California. And this was something that, in my mind, it seemed appropriate. It seemed like the right thing to do. And LA Taco did have a follow-up story that touched on what happened with this great headline. This is the beginning of healing. Descendants of Tongva, Chumash, and Tataviam tribes organized the toppling of Junipero Serra statue in the birthplace of LA. Now, I shared that video because, number one, this is genuinely historic, because Junipero Serra is somebody that, at least, and I can't speak for what your fourth grade was like, but at least for myself, he was a name that was constantly coming up in California history classes that I had to take in elementary school. And we treated him like he was any other guy from history. It was kind of like, all right, kids, do your best picture of Father Junipero Serra. And it was awkward because this was a guy who helped perpetuate genocide on indigenous peoples in California in a way that the United States couldn't even fully do in the 1800s. Basically, like, what I'm saying is the conquistadors were far more effective than our feckless country was in the 1800s, but it came at the cost of not just human life, but of a whole culture that is radically different from most of the other 500 indigenous nations across the Western Hemisphere. And a good mutual friend of ours, and it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy, by the way, because I never expected, of all the people that you and I know, I never expected this guy to be the one that to open up the can of worms on Serra and his legacy. And he asked a really simple question about, he went to Junipero Serra High School, and I don't know much of the controversy. Can anyone fill me in? And so I immediately replied, and I said, Serra started the mission system in Baja and Alta California in the late 1700s. The Padres used indigenous slave labor to build the missions, converting them to Christianity and rendering languages and cultures extinct. Now, of course, I got the full brunt of the bots and sort of, I guess you could say, Catholic nationalists that decided to come after me, saying it was a lie and that it wasn't true, and Serra was flawed, but he was really good for the Indians, and pathetic nonsense like that, calling me misinformed and saying my research was biased, which, it's funny how that's always the go-to.
That's always the go-to argument, because I've been on the tail end of that argument where it's like, oh well, if it wasn't for the fucking conquistadors, they'd still be praying to their multiple gods and sacrificing people on top of pillars, and I'm like, okay, given, but to to completely bastardize an entire race of people, not to mention slaughter them in cold blood, what's the lesser of two evils here, right?
Yeah. Well,
at least when they were sacrificing themselves, it was a fucking way of life. Okay.
Well, I think with the funny part about this is that, and I've just been straightforward with these people, because, if you're some bot that thinks Donald Trump is the greatest thing in the world and Russia's cool too, I don't need to engage with you. And, if you're going to tell me I'm biased and then I go to your Twitter profile and your whole description basically explains why you're defending colonialism, then there's no arguing around you. Because if you're going to say to me, these non-facts that don't make any sense nor have any relevance to what I'm saying, i.e., Black Lives Matter is Marxist, what does that have to do with anything that I'm informing you about Junipero Serra's treatment of California's indigenous people? I mean, and I did actually get kind of the help from a Julia Lewandowski. Shout out to you, by the way, Julia. She's got a great background in education and she's a historian on early North American history and on the indigenous peoples of North America. And so the way I saw it, her credibility far outdid mine. But it of course leads to the bigger issue that, of course, we're seeing regularly, which is about the statues and monuments to not just men of the Confederate States of America, but also just bad men from our history that for some reason are commemorated with statues. Now, I guess what's kind of been your what's kind of been your take on everything that's gone on with the removal of statues ever since this kind of became a big thing, which arguably was around the time Charlottesville happened?
We'll go back to the restoration argument. Okay, theoretically, when you take down one of these statues, the logical consensus, or at least I want to say the perceived consensus, is that you're erasing a piece of history that was stained, with something better there, right? Now, I truthfully didn't really have an opinion with the removal of said statues, because what better way to learn from your mistakes than seeing it right there in front of you and knowing what not to do? It seems a little counterintuitive, but do I think that this is a step in the right direction? Yes, of course. Is the public outcry warranted? To those in support of these statues, first of all, get off your lazy boy, fistful of Cheez-Its in hand, and stop commenting every 5 seconds about some asinine Facebook discussion because you got nothing going on in your life. But to those who are actually doing this for a reason, then yes, I do feel that it is a step in the right direction.
Because I think, and I think there's a point that I do want to get to that kind of ties.
I'm sorry. I think, just to continue, I think my question would be, what is going in place of this statue that would be more beneficial? Right. So, I'm not saying nothing has to go there, but if something were to go there, it would encapsulate. I graduated from college, all right? It would encapture something that is more politically correct, I would say, that doesn't spark a heated debate over what historically was, because we know what historically was and the mistakes that it led to, and granted, yes, you should be able to learn from that with or without the statue. Again, like I've been saying for a lot of the episodes thus far. What's next? I'd like to know.
Well, and I think there's one particular what's next that cropped up, and I found out about it through, I was watching a Twitch stream with one of the guys from Chapo, and he was talking about the election, and then he started talking about the removal of monuments and statues. Let's have more statues dedicated to Sojourner Truth. Or, Harriet Tubman was supposed to be on the $20 bill, and then Donald Trump became president, and that got squashed. So we still have a racist, slave-owning, genocidal maniac of a president who looks like the Joker, and I'm not talking about Donald Trump. Andrew Jackson still on the $20 bill.
Right.
And, just showing some humanity, I guess, because this was something that a buddy of mine that I used to work with shared on Facebook, where he shared this woman's status about going to Germany. And, I'm sure you've heard this point and this is the point I've been bringing up to people who still don't get it, which is, if you went to Germany and you saw a statue acknowledging any Nazi, it doesn't matter if it's Hitler, Goebbels, Goering, whoever, if you saw a monument dedicated to a Nazi, how would you feel? And miraculously, the responses have gone from just about everywhere to, I wouldn't like it, to, well, it's their history. And
yeah,
and the problem with me.
Well, I'm sorry to cut you off. It's just like
right,
part of me is willing in again, kind of this weird oxymoron fucking way of being complacent to showcase what the mistakes of history are. Okay, I'm not saying that you should outright glorify the people on these statues, but by having a physical representation of who and what that person was back then, and also kind of the commentary of having it be up in the first place. So, I kind of like to look at this as much of an opportunist as possible by looking at that statue, saying, okay, here's a statue of Adolf Hitler. I know who he was. I know what he did. I know why it was bad, and I know why he was removed. Well, theoretically removed, as in shuffling off this mortal coil.
Right.
Why is that? But you focus on the why. Why is that statue up in the first place? And you go down, a historical rabbit hole of, okay, it's up there. We know why it's up there. What can you take away from it? Right. I'm not saying glorify the man, obviously, even though I'm sure people down south would disagree. But, I think for sake of understanding who a particular horrible person was in history, it's, in some instances, it's effective to let it stay as a reminder,
Right. Well, and I think as well, and of course it's kind of an obvious point, and you kind of just touched on it just now too, where you mentioned about people in the South and how they might feel with statues, and obviously you get the argument of, oh well, it's my heritage, it's my culture, and of course there was a great meme that I scrolled by this past week where a guy who had the Confederate flag on his head said, oh, those statues are part of my history and heritage. So is the Confederate flag. And he's saying that to somebody with the American flag on their head. And they say, that's funny because destroying the Confederacy is part of my heritage. And the Confederate guy looks at him for a second, and then in the next slide, he's angry because he's realizing, wait a minute, I'm talking to somebody who in the 1860s would have been my enemy, probably.
Right.
And I think, that's what makes these statues different from anything else. Because, I've argued with people, the Civil War is really the only war in history where we have statues for people on both sides of the war. You don't see any Saddam Hussein statues in Kenosha. or her,
yeah,
or
that's the
a
thing.
or a
That's why
statue
Lincoln.
of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna in Chicago.
That's
Like,
why Lincoln got a whole memorial dedicated to him, and Lee got one fucking statue. So in essence of showing both sides of the battle, as opposed to just looking in a history book, I guess, you have that physical reminder of what the country was, as well as how we moved on from that. Now, to the people poo-pooing the Lee statue, by the way, has that been chartered to be removed or something recently? Or has it been removed?
which Lee statue?
Oh God.
Because I know there was a statue of John C. Calhoun I think it was in Charleston, South Carolina, that was recommended to be taken down, to which I say, finally, you're 200 years on time.
Yeah. It's Richmond, Virginia, the Robert E. Memorial.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and don't forget as well, that's the tricky part with the Confederacy, is that, and this is what makes them different from any other enemy that the United States has ever had militarily, they were still Americans. They were the Confederate States of America.
Yeah. So,
they still looked at George Washington as the father of their country and a hero. Granted, he was also a Virginian.
Oh yeah.
need that as it be, but
yeah.
And of course in the South, the Civil War is typically referred to as the War of Northern Aggression. So it's,
yeah.
But I think the what I was getting at with the Germany story was that this buddy of mine shared the status by a woman who went to Germany with her family, and she noticed that instead of having any statues acknowledging Nazi leaders, which, again, if we went to Germany and if we saw that, we'd be mortified. Instead, they have statues that acknowledge or in some way commemorate victims of the Holocaust. Because that is the way that is the way history is being told. And I think that is far more healthy and far, far, far better, because it's placing an emphasis on who was wronged during that time period that the Nazis were in charge. It was just about everybody who wasn't a Nazi, but it included people who were handicapped, people who were Jewish, people who were Romani, and if you were handicapped in any way, and if you were a political prisoner, if you were a socialist or a communist, that's why I even said earlier about, why don't we have something commemorating Sojourner Truth or Frederick Douglass or, I mentioned Harriet Tubman or Nat Turner. I mean, and hell, extend it. Have statues that commemorate people like Geronimo or Sitting Bull or, hell, Corn Planter from the Iroquois Confederacy. I mean, I think it's the decolonization and the de-whitening of American history, I think. And I think as somebody who, and me, history's been my bread and butter for a long time. And I've always looked at history through the side of the people that may not have gotten the longer end of the stick. But I have also realized that there is something in their story that must be told and people must remember it. And I think this country has a real problem with that, because in Germany, they want people to remember the fact that they led one of the worst crimes in all of human history. But in the United States, we push it aside and say, it's over. It's part of our history. And we really are the United States of amnesia, as Gore Vidal would say, in that we would rather just completely ignore our history. It's not even a matter of forgetting it. It's ignoring it like it ever happened. But if you ignore what happened, then you're ignoring things that people hold dear. There's a reason why George Washington is referred to as the father of our country. You can't ignore that.
Yeah. And you also can't ignore the fact that he owned slaves as well.
Exactly.
Right? So you take your wins with you take your historical wins with your losses, pretty much. And as much as everyone likes to fucking cherry pick history and choose what best represents them as an American. You aren't going to get a clean slate, obviously. Okay.
Right.
As much as you'd probably want, as much as I'm sure some people out there, predominantly perusing the boards of Stormfront and 4chan would attest to, as much as the whole bootstrap, I was born, fought, and died in this here country mentality.
Yeah.
As it is to some degree, you can't just cherry pick the good parts,
No.
You know what they and I mean, what they say, well, history is written by the winners. That would be the case, but if that was the case in everyone's mentality, then there'd be no protests, would there?
Right. And on top of that, wouldn't Lincoln be considered a total loser, at least in the eyes of current
well, that's the thing. Lincoln didn't even free the slaves as many history teachers or elementary school teachers would want to tell you. Matter of fact, he let them do what they wanted as long as he ran the country. Well, he was pretty complacent about it. Right?
Oh, he was. He was willing to.
But people don't mention that.
No, they don't. Well, it's about being honest
because they want to have this. Yeah. Well, the truth fucking hurts, doesn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, with Lincoln, that's the sad part about Lincoln and his legacy is that he did not start the Civil War because he wanted to free all the slaves, which is exactly what we're told in elementary school. He said, if I win this war and free all the slaves, I will. But if I fight this war and I win it and I free no slaves, I will. And that's not a quote verbatim, but that was how he got into the Civil War. And it wasn't until 1863, and then a further extension of that, which led to Juneteenth, that led to emancipation. But then at the further end of the spectrum, you have Reconstruction, which that's a whole episode in of itself, but that was an unmitigated disaster. And arguably, had Ulysses S. Grant, who was our 18th president, had he been far more stricter with the South, one could argue that Jim Crow, the Ku Klux Klan, and all of these statues that commemorate a bygone era would not exist. The South probably would be a far more industrialized area and arguably a far more updated area than, it currently is. But to the point I was making about Matt Chrisman on Twitch talking about the statues, he brought up an interesting point, and this is where it kind of ties in with the restoration aspect, which is, okay, so we're pulling these statues down, and even statues of people that seemed safe are getting it. Like, years ago, I don't know if you'd heard about this thing called the Jefferson-Jackson dinner, where a bunch of like elites and politicians gather together and they hold this big dinner that's held in the name of Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson. Those dinners stopped because of the fact that Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson were slave owners, and also of Andrew Jackson's catastrophic Indian policy. But the point in this video was, and this is where I ask you this very same question, do you think Mount Rushmore is on the list of places to go? And I don't mean places to go as in places to visit.
What are they going to do? Dynamite the whole mountain? I mean, look,
it is on Indian land. The Black Hills are sacred to the Lakota Nation. That's like building a statue on somebody's church. I'll put it that way. That's the best way to put it.
Yeah. But what do you want anyone to say, that we're just gonna blow up this mountain that's renowned as one of the 7 wonders of the world, kind of thing, and that's undoubtedly the middle-aged conservative argument here.
Right.
Well, you're just gonna ruin refined history. It's like, yeah, there was history there before Mount Rushmore existed. right? And that's the whole point of, you could put in air quotes restoration. Oh, we're just making the mountain better by carving 4 fucking faces into it. Right? So,
well, and don't forget as well
really
the history of the guy who made Mount Rushmore, Gutzon Borglum.
Mm-hmm.
He's got a sketchy history involving the KKK, and he also did a Confederate monument in the South etched into the side. I'm blanking on the name of it, but there's a prominent Confederate monument. I have to look up Gutzon Borglum, but he did this whole monument where it's, I think, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and a third Confederate in the side of this hill. And I am reading, by the way, that he was a member of the KKK. Oh, geez, that's bad. Let me see if I can find the name.
God, aren't all artists racist? What, wasn't Hitler an art student or something?
He was. I mean,
and then his art career failed. And he's like, eh.
Well, and on top of that, he had all of his insecurities after World War I. Here we go. Damn it, they just call it the Confederate Memorial. Well, there's a bas-relief sculpture, the largest bas-relief sculpture in the world, with Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson Davis, who was the Confederate president. That was also by Gutzon Borglum. And so now it can be argued that that's probably going to be the one to go first between that one and Mount Rushmore. But personally, and I've funny enough, I know an immense deal about the state of South Dakota, as weird as that sentence sounds. That was my state project back in elementary school. I still haven't been. My sister got to go to her mission and her state before I ever got to go to my mission or my state. I still haven't gone to St. Louis Obispo, so c'est la vie.
I mean, you're not
missing
to South much. Dakota. It's all flat land,
But for me, it's the Lakota history with, you have the Pine Ridge Reservation there. That's where, not that far away from where the Wounded Knee Massacre took place. It's also where the siege at Wounded Knee took place back in the 1970s. Some of my personal heroes literally held up in the dead of winter just to stick it to the FBI and Richard Nixon, saying, we're Indian, we're here, and we want our land back. And the Black Hills, they're beautiful, they're sacred to the Lakota. This is the land that Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Red Cloud, a whole plethora of great leaders and just great men of history have lived. And, if our goal is to lead ourselves into a new society, a better society, and this was the argument that Matt Crispin was making, if we are to lead ourselves into a new society that is much more tolerant, much more aware of racism and racist acts, and calling out Karens up the wazoo, and if we're removing all of these ye olde badges of civilization and chivalry, wouldn't we extend that as well to the big sculpt work, and admiring 2 slave owners, a guy who fought a civil war that wasn't intended to free slaves, even though the war was about slavery, and also with Teddy Roosevelt, a frickin' imperialist, the guy who basically helped the United States become an even greater empire than it was at the turn of the 20th century. And all of their big, white, lily white faces are on the face of Indian sacred territory. To them, this is where the world began. I referred to myself as an atheist earlier, but at the same time, I'm going to be on the side of somebody who was colonized rather than the side of the colonizer. And, I've thought about it, and as much as it would be fascinating to see it, it wouldn't hurt my feelings if anything were to happen to it. my whole life, ever since I was a kid, I've advocated for we need to be responsible about our history. We cannot repeat it, obviously. I think you have a lot of people now that are learning that and realizing we do need to be far more respectful and responsible about our history, but that also means giving ourselves a better society so that we're not repeating the same mistakes of the past.
I gotta tell you, because I know you don't play video games, or at least not to the rate that I do, and even then, that's not a lot. But right now, they're doing this deal on PlayStation where they give away 2 free games, and one of them was Call of Duty World War II. Now, I despise everything Call of Duty, Activision, Treyarch. You know, you can't swing a dead rat without hitting shit in their general vicinity. Okay. But then again, this game took about 8 hours to beat. You go through the entirety of World War II here, right? So you storm the beach. You storm the beaches of Normandy when you first start off, and for all intents and purposes, I'm just going to spoil the ending here because it's fucking World War II. You know how it ends.
Wait, World War II ended? What?
Yeah, no, we won. Yeah, but at the very end, you actually storm and infiltrate Birkenau, or I think a concentration camp, like some unnamed, and you know, but yeah, and it was like holy shit. My mom and my stepdad were there watching me, and they're like, they put this in a game? I'm like, I know. And I think a lot of people take away different lessons and historical takes in different ways. You know, some people take it out in documentaries and TV and film and books. You know, I've played a lot of video games, and at least for me, it stood out. I mean, I knew it was wrong, all of what Germany did in the years in the 40s, but to see it depicted in this medium was a nice touch. It really was. I think it really showcased what was important. I mean, of course, it had the whole gung ho. Oh, we're in the army. We're gonna storm it. You know, it knew when to be somber and it knew when to be serious. At least in the ending act. And I don't know. Fuck the Nazis.
Well, and consider that too. You know, we have. You know, I've had the chance to visit the Museum of Tolerance in the past. Just in the last year, I went to the Los Angeles has another Holocaust museum it's a little smaller, but I had the chance to visit that. And, you know, you almost have to think, okay, so we live in a world where statues commemorating actual Nazis don't exist. Okay, fine. However, we have museums and, you know, archives that basically acknowledge and remember the Holocaust. And of course, that's the word remember is something you always hear, and it's poignant, and it's basically it's the kind of point that, you know, it's the point from people that are telling other people, you know, you need to remember your history. And the fact that having museums that acknowledge the Holocaust, it's in a way it's like part of everyday life, because the Holocaust was a moment in history. We acknowledge it, we remember it, we mourn, we move on, but we also educate.
Right.
You never see anybody politically go after a Holocaust museum. Now, on the flip side, you then have, and I'm blanking on the exact name of it, but I know that there's a museum somewhere, I believe in the South, maybe more Midwest, but I know there's a museum that's dedicated to the history of lynching in the South.
Right.
And I know that was a museum that a lot of, I'll just say a lot of red meat politicians were very verklempt over. And frankly, I don't find that to be problematic that such museums exist, because that is basically the exact same tactic that Germany and arguably our own country is taking in order to remember historical atrocities. And I know that the United States has a very bad history of acknowledging its own atrocities. For example, Japanese internment camps, they never are referred to as concentration camps.
Right.
The original reservations back in the 1800s that American Indians were forced onto, those were concentration camps. And the detention facilities, as politicians refer to them along our southern border, those are concentration camps by definition. And a lot of people think a concentration camp only applies to World War II. But that is entirely ignorant of the rest of the world and how badly the rest of the world has treated one another outside of World War II. And it's shameful because it again goes to my point about these are people that want to forget history. They want to forget it. They want to ignore that it ever happened and just go along with their day. And the problem is that you don't develop any discussion, nor do you develop any understanding when you say, oh, the lynching museum's a bad idea. We just need to go along with our day. Well, it's a part of our history, like it or not. I mean, why do you think, it's kind of like, well, why do you think the Wounded Knee Memorial in South Dakota is coveted? That's sacred land that's only been around since 1890 when 300 men, women, and children were slaughtered by our army. And so, and of course, this goes to the point about, there's been kind of a smattering of news stories involving nooses. And, I think it's safe to say it's an issue that you and I take extraordinarily seriously.
Yeah.
And it's something where if people are going to get upset over a museum that acknowledges that part of our history, then those people really need to relearn their history, or at least learn, to paraphrase one of my trolls, learn an unbiased history instead of whatever Brian Kilmeade feeds you. Which,
what
by the way,
unbiased history?
Which,
if you're going to be, go on.
Sorry, I was just going to add one last point on the Mount Rushmore thing. For anybody that thinks I'm crazy about the whole concept of, is Mount Rushmore up for grabs, I guess you could say. There's actually a really great book, a great novel from several years ago called Black Hills by Dan Simmons that addresses the very issue of what would happen if somebody who watched all of his people get slaughtered over a 30-year period ends up becoming decades later becomes a laborer sculpting Mount Rushmore, and he also has to be there for its opening presentation with Franklin D. Roosevelt, but then he decides whether or not to blow up Mount Rushmore during said celebration. It's a very interesting story, and it's fictional and it's written by a white guy, but nonetheless, it's still something that I think it's worth checking out just for people that want a better understanding of how much the Black Hills mean to the Lakota people. And with that note, Sebastian, good sir, where can the good people find you?
Well, I just had a drink, so I can get through this actually pretty fast. You can find me on all these available platforms. Instagram, Twitter, even though I despise it. Dr. Sebi, at Dr. Sebi, at DRSEBBY. All one word for Instagram. Twitter, there is an underscore at DR_SEBBY. When it comes to additional media, you can find me as well on YouTube at Seabass, yes, like the fish. You can also find me on Anchor as well. That is where I keep all my audio files, sort of like an archive, but it's more of a secondary source for the narrations that I post on YouTube. Keep on the lookout for new additional projects coming out. I actually recently finished 2 more songs. I dare call them songs because, actually, I don't even know why I call them songs, because they're not lyrical in the slightest. They're actually instrumental. I'm going to be going under the monogram of Shugsy, like Shugsy Storytime. You know the one. Just look it up on Google as well. Feel free to send me any manuscripts to Sebastian Shug Publishing, now an official accredited Better Business Bureau business. Full. I decided to take the next step, and here we are. Other than that, I suppose you can. I suppose you could find me just by searching on Google. That's Sebastian Shug. Books published regularly. If you excuse me, I'm going to crack that against my head, relive my undergraduate years, and yeah, where can the good people find you?
So, when I'm not reading Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class, you can find me on Twitter at ManciniRA. History lessons to Spanish nationalists, and you'll find me on Instagram sharing whatever information I can find regarding the local protests. That could be anything from what is going on in and around SoCal, as well as what is going on near my little piece of land right here adjacent next door, which that next door being Santa Clarita. We'll have the link in the description for this episode on where you can find us on YouTube. Naturally, we'll be sharing it on our Twitter and Facebook and Instagram feeds. And before we let you all go, as always, we want to give a quick shout out to our good pal Janice. She has another great new episode of The Jump Off, well worth checking out.
You've been listening to Mars on Life. Please make sure that you find us over on social media at Mars on Life Show on both Twitter and on Instagram. And on top of that, you can find this show on Anchor, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Our artwork is done by Zachary Erberich, and our intro music is Space Explorers by Kevin MacLeod. I've been Ryan Mancini. My co-host, as always, is Sebastian Shug. And just remember, if you keep on going, you'll make it to Mars.